Hey everyone, this is Randall and welcome back to the Imperial Minis channel. For this video we're going to focus on a game I haven't discussed yet on the channel. That game is Moonstone by Goblin King Games. I have a sort of unofficial rule of two when it comes to my gaming time. I only actively involve myself in two game systems at a time. As many of you know, A Song of Ice and Fire from CMON is the primary game I play and the subject of most of the videos on this channel. Moonstone is my second game. And this is the first time it's been mentioned on the channel, although for anyone who follows my Instagram, link in the description, you'll have seen me painting Moonstone minis now for a very long time. In this video, I'm going to very quickly introduce my viewers to the game of Moonstone by briefly discussing the rules of the game, doing a quick video showcase of my painted units so far, and explain why I'm so enamored with this game. The developer, Goblin King Games, describes Moonstone as an award-winning fantasy skirmish game for 2 to 4 players, which sees you leading fairy tale-inspired characters in search of precious moonstones. It uses unique card mechanics where players predict, misdirect, and bluff their way to victory. In Moonstone, players bring troops of up to 6 characters from 3 different factions. A fourth faction, the undead/risen/waggly, no longer quite alive, Shades of Moonreach, will soon be released. At 6 characters per troop, the painting time and financial investment to play this game is relatively small, unless you, like me, can't help but collect every box from the factions you're interested in. Miniatures in Moonstone have no points cost. There are no army building points whatsoever in this game. You simply select the 6 miniatures you want for your troop, according to faction alignment, and you're set. The game is very well balanced, and so full of various synergies that there's no clear best 6 miniatures to pick for any given faction. Once you and your opponent have your troops selected, you'll deploy them on opposite sides of a 3x3 playing space, decorated with a moderate amount of terrain, but careful not to overly clutter the center, as a lot of activity is likely to take place there. Before deploying your troop, you'll harvest the moonstones by dropping a handful of 7 of them a foot from the center of the table. Each player can mulligan 1 drop, so you could drop moonstones up to 3 times before the game begins. Each moonstone is a d4 die, and the number that faces up represents the depth that moonstone is buried, and, by extension, the difficulty in harvesting it. The stage is then set for the mayhem to begin. The winner is the player who holds the most moonstones at the end of 4 turns. Conceivably, you could also win by tabling your opponent and killing their entire troop, but I have never seen this happen. Now, unlike many other miniatures games, dice are not used to determine the results of combat or the casting of arcane abilities. These are resolved through a melee deck and an arcane deck, respectively. Let's take a quick look at what these decks are composed of. The melee deck is shared between both players and is composed of 3 copies each of 6 cards, for a total of 18 cards. These cards all effectively represent a different melee move, and each card shows what the results of combat will be based on which card your opponent plays. Melee cards are generally revealed simultaneously, and then combat is resolved. So if, for example, my model plays a falling swing, and my opponent plays a high guard, you can see that neither of us do any damage to each other. Since the null icon of my opponent is highlighted, however, this means he gets to throw down another melee card for free, and I can't react to it with a new card of my own, and I deal no damage to him in return. You can kind of think of this like a counter-strike or riposte. Now let's say my opponent also played a falling swing. So we both drop our weapons down on each other and our weapons meet harmlessly. You may notice there are both a 0 and a null on these different melee cards. In the case of this falling swing versus falling swing, we each deal 0 wounds. The 0 allows for other modifiers to come into play, however, such as, for example, a passive ability granting your model extra damage for a particular type of damage. So even though it may say 0 here, you could then add any passive damage modifiers you may have. So in the example here, Gotchgut, the giant, has a flat +2 damage to all attacks, which is a pretty amazing attack bonus. So instead of dealing 0 wounds, he would actually deal 2 wounds. Moving on to the arcane deck. The arcane deck is shared between both players and composed of 3 colors of cards, pink, green, and blue. For each color there are 3 1s, 2 2s, and 1 3. There are also 3 catastrophe cards in the deck. We'll explain catastrophes a bit more later. But for now, we'll just say that these arcane cards are drawn when one player attempts to cast an arcane ability, and based on which cards they draw, they may successfully resolve that ability or not. Bluffing is also always an option in Moonstone, so even if you don't draw the arcane card you need, you may be able to bluff your way to success. Be careful though, because your opponent may call your bluff and slap you with a catastrophe. Let's have a quick look at the character card, since much of the game's rules really come down to individual characters' abilities. Here's Beaky Bobby. He's a goblin, shaman, wizard, medicine man kind of character. He's one of the 4 goblin characters that comes in the 2 faction starter box. Let's start off at the bottom of Bobby's card and take a look at his health and energy. The blue bubbles show how much energy Beaky Bobby has to draw on each turn. Active and arcane abilities cost energy, as do other base actions like harvesting moonstones or taking step actions. Energy management is one of the cornerstones of this game. As Beaky Bobby takes damage, he may lose access to one of those energy bubbles. If Beaky Bobby has taken, let's say, 3 damage, then between turns, during the replenish step, he will only replenish 3 energy instead of 4. Now let's have a look at Bobby's base stats. Melee. So Bobby has a melee stat of 2. This means that when he's engaged in a melee action, either initiated by himself or the opponent, he will draw 2 melee cards from the melee deck. The character who initiates the melee can draw 2 extra cards, so if Bobby is the attacker, he would draw 4 cards. One additional dimension to melee attacks that we did not discuss earlier is a model's signature move. Each model has its own signature move that can be used when you play the appropriate melee card. Taking Beaky Bobby as the example, he can trigger his signature move when he plays a thrust card. His signature move, Take Your Medicine, converts a thrust, which would normally deal piercing damage, into a magical attack. Magic damage is much harder to mitigate, since armor does not stop it. This signature move gives Beaky Bobby a bit more punch in melee, particularly if he's matched up against Commonwealth humans like those he shares the starter box with. I like to picture his signature move as Beaky Bobby removing a volatile flask of liquid from his coat and smashing it in the face of his opponent. No amount of plate armor will help you there. Range. This shows how close Bobby must be to an enemy character to initiate melee combat. An opponent with a range greater than his could attack him, and while Bobby would still draw his 2 melee cards, he would not inflict any melee damage since the opponent would be outside of his melee range. He could still block the damage, however, as we saw from the melee cards earlier. Arcane. This shows how many cards from the Arcane deck Bobby can draw when he initiates one of his Arcane abilities. Beaky Bobby only has 1 Arcane ability, Healing, which we will explain shortly. The Arcane deck will determine whether Bobby's player can successfully cast that Arcane ability. Evade. This stat modifies your opponent's Arcane hand. The lower this number, i.e. a negative number is good, the fewer Arcane cards your opponent can draw to cast one of their Arcane abilities. This is to simulate a character being either small and harder to hit, or large and easier to hit. The number could be anywhere from a -2 in the case of the diminutive fairies, to a +2 in the case of giants. In the case of giants, the opponent casting an Arcane ability against them would draw +2 cards into their Arcane hand. In the case of Beaky Bobby, to keep things simple, let's say an opponent with an Arcane stat of 4 attempts to cast an Arcane ability against Bobby. That Arcane stat of 4 drops to a 3, since Bobby has a -1 evade stat, which would then allow that player to only draw 3 cards instead of 4. The resisting player, in this case Bobby's player, always draws 6 Arcane cards as their resist hand, regardless of whether they're a sneaky little goblin wizard like Bobby or a slow, dopey giant. Arcane card draw can be further modified by any cover that the defending model has, but we won't go into that further in this video. Now, the abilities on the card are broken into 3 types: passive, active, and arcane. Passive abilities are always active on that character. In Bobby's case, he's a weakling, so he'll do less melee damage and have a harder time digging up moonstones. He also has some resistance to magic damage. Active abilities are performed by using your energy and do not require any drawing of Arcane cards. If you have the requisite energy, the ability pops off. In the case of Beaky Bobby, he can use 1 energy to perform an AoE movement pulse, pushing all other models away from him, be they friend or foe. This can help Beaky Bobby make himself harder to reach by an opponent, or conversely give some teammates an out-of-activation push up the table. His Foul Gases ability is an area of effect damage ability that damages Beaky Bobby and anyone else unfortunate enough to be within 2 inches of him. The final type of ability are Arcane abilities. Beaky Bobby has 1 Arcane ability, Healing. It costs 2 energy to perform and can be cast on a target within 8 inches of Bobby. Let's quickly walk through how the casting of this Arcane ability would work in practice. Beaky Bobby with an Arcane stat of 5 would draw 5 cards. Bobby's opponent, regardless of whether Bobby is targeting one of their units or not, will draw 6 Arcane cards as the resisting player. Beaky Bobby's player needs to draw any blue card to successfully cast the healing ability. The amount of healing is X plus 1, where X is the value of the blue card that's drawn, be it 1, 2, or 3. Let's walk through the casting of this arcane healing ability. Beaky Bobby's player draws 5 cards in accordance with his arcane stat in an attempt to heal one of his badly wounded fellow goblins. The resisting player will then draw 6 cards, as is standard, whether the active player is targeting one of their units with an arcane ability or not. Beaky Bobby's player has lucked out with this hand. He has a blue 2 and a blue 1. The player then announces, "I have a blue 2," and he places his card face down on the table. The opposing player looks at his hand to see if perhaps he has all of the blue 2s in his hand, or if perhaps he has one of them, he considers whether it's worth calling his opponent's bluff. The opposing player with only one blue 1 in his hand says, "Okay, that's fine, you can have it." So Beaky Bobby now successfully heals his friendly model for 3 wounds, and his opponent's arcane cards are shuffled back into the arcane deck. Beaky Bobby's player does not need to reveal whether he actually had the blue 2 or not, since his opponent did not call his bluff. Now, if the opponent had called Beaky Bobby's bluff, the active player would have revealed the card he selected. Since it was in fact a blue 2, the spell still fires off successfully. But now, since the bluff was called and he was telling the truth, Beaky Bobby's player gets to select another card from his hand to play, if he so chooses. Knowing he has another blue card in his hand, he then says, "I'll cast Beaky Bobby's healing spell again on this other model over here, and I have a blue 1. So he'll put his card down on the table, and this would heal that model for 2 wounds. The opposing player, not wanting to press his luck at this point, accepts the additional heal, and it goes off successfully. Now for one final scenario. Let's say that Beaky Bobby's player was extremely greedy or desperate and really needed a big heal. He looks at his hand, and not only does he not see a blue 3, he sees no blue cards at all. What a mess. Well, since bluffing is always an option in Moonstone, he decides to slap a pink 1 face down and confidently declare, "I have a blue 3. The opposing player does not have the blue 3 in his hand, but allowing his opponent to heal 4 wounds onto one of his models could be game-changing. While he doesn't have a blue 3, he does have a catastrophe card. So, he decides to call his opponent's bluff, telling him, "I don't believe you, let's see it." Beaky Bobby's player then reluctantly flips his card over to reveal his pink 1, after which his opponent slaps down a catastrophe card. Reading Beaky Bobby's unit card again, we see that if he suffers a catastrophe to his healing spell, he suffers 2 wounds. Not the end of the world, and worth the risk, but now it means that he will replenish 1 fewer energy between rounds, since that second wound now removes that 4th energy globe. Now we'll have a very quick and dirty on how the game plays out. Once both players have deployed their units on the table, and the player with initiative activates their first unit, they can expend their unit's energy in whatever manner they please. Each model gets a free jog action during their activation, which is a 4-inch move. If the model has the slow passive ability, or if they're carrying a Moonstone, they can only jog 2 inches. They can use their energy on active or arcane abilities, using 1 energy at a time to take 1-inch step actions, or using 1 energy to perform a harvest action to raise a Moonstone 1 depth level or to pick it up. Models need not use all their energy during their activation, however. They can hold on to some to use as reaction steps during enemy turns. After an enemy performs any action, you may use one of your model's remaining energy to take a 1-inch reaction step. This can be especially useful if you need to back away from an opponent who's bearing down on one of your models, or conversely, if you want to step closer to an enemy model who might be trying to attack you from outside of your own melee range. The game takes place over 4 turns, and the player who is holding the most Moonstones at the end of turn 4 wins. It's a pretty simple premise, and the core rules themselves are quite straightforward. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, much of the strategy and minutiae of the rules come down to each individual model's abilities and how they synergize with the troop that they're a part of. There is an optional campaign deck you can purchase if you'd like to follow the game's campaign rules and string together a series of battles into a campaign. The campaign deck contains campaign cards and a really cool set of upgrade cards that can be earned and attached to characters in your troop to give them extra abilities. Now let's move on to the model showcase, and then we'll wrap up with a few words about why I love this game. The first set of minis come from the 2-player starter set. So first, Doug the Flatulent. Now, it's worth mentioning that Doug is the name of the pug, atop whom Sir Pubert the Goblin rides. Doug is a very fast and potentially very lethal charger. He has a 3-inch attack range, allowing him to poke enemies outside of their own melee range. Vicious Sid has one of the lowest health pools of any non-fairy model in the Dominion faction. That said, he is a brutal melee fighter who restores energy each time he damages an enemy, allowing him to potentially keep attacking and attacking and attacking. His plate armor also helps him to stay standing longer than his health might suggest he's able to. We've looked at Beaky Bobby quite a bit already, so I won't dwell on him too much. He's a great healer for the Dominion, able to cast his healing ability twice with full energy. Grub is what happens when a goblin reads one too many dangerous arcane tomes and begins to transform into a fairy. Grub has a very unique ability to essentially blink around the battlefield when he's in contact with pieces of obstacle terrain. This makes him a flanker who can be almost anywhere instantly, and a model who can pick up an isolated Moonstone more quickly than other models can get to them. This next set of models come from the Rule the Roost troop box. First, Herbert Growbottom. Herbert is the evolved version of Grub, who has completed his metamorphosis into a fairy. Interestingly, he has both the goblin and fairy keywords, which allows him to benefit from synergies involving both of those types of models. Herbert can spawn wooded patches onto the table, and then he can blink between them to cover ground quickly and to hide in the cover that the wooded patches provide. The Goblin King is one of my favorite models in the game. He's the king, what more is there to say? He is technically King Cuthbert Stonefrog, 7th of his name, ruler of the bestest isle, seer of the seen things, holder of the sacred cockerel crown, chosen of the feathered ones, most flatulent among us. He excels at stealing moonstones from his fellow goblins, allowing them to continue on about their usual business unhindered by their precious cargo. He also has a unique ability to bonk a friendly goblin on the noggin, dealing them a small amount of damage but giving them 2 energy and allowing them to immediately reactivate after his activation. This double activation can be devastating at the right moment. The Mortician is an interesting model in that he can heal, like Beaky Bobby, but he doesn't have as much energy natively, which makes him a bit of a worse healer. What he has, however, is the ability to reanimate a previously slain model with half of their total health. This ability could be a game changer in the right situation, but it synergizes particularly well with an upcoming model we'll discuss in the next troop box. Next up is the Death and Taxes troop box. First up, the Tax Collector. Now this surly bureaucrat specializes in bullying enemy models who are holding moonstones, and she also gets stronger and more resilient in melee when she's fighting an enemy who is in possession of a moonstone. It's also worth noting that all of her abilities are either passive or active. She never has to draw any arcane cards to pull off her various abilities. Portly Pete. This rotund fellow has the unique ability to lock away a moonstone inside of his armor, preventing the opponent from using abilities that foist that moonstone away from him. The only way for an opponent to take a moonstone from Pete is to slay him. This ability does not affect friendly units, however, so the Goblin King can still use his Gimme ability to snatch the moonstone away from Pete for safekeeping. Pete is also able to body block incoming damage for another goblin carrying a moonstone. Pete is not an early riser, however, and he's a goblin who likes his naps. As such, he can never be the first model you activate in a turn, but once he has activated, or been woken up, his melee and evade stat improve. Joby. So Joby's the first dual faction model we've shown so far. Joby is also the first model in the game that can be played in the Shades faction. The Shades are the newest faction of wacky undead, or fundead as some folks like to call them. Now, if you're a fast reader, you can tell that Joby's abilities largely revolve around taking moonstones and dying, again and again. If you have a model in your troop with the reanimate ability, like the Mortician, Joby can be reanimated for free and come back with full health and 2 energy. He may also still activate on the turn he's reanimated. What this means is that early in the turn, Joby could pull off some of his moonstone snatching shenanigans, then kill himself, and then have the Mortician activate, reanimate Joby, and then activate Joby again later in the turn. The next model we're going to talk about is the Fire Spitter, who comes alone in his own box. So the Fire Spitter is the first single model box we've shown so far. Typically the larger models, like Trolls and Giants, are sold as single models in a unit box. The Fire Spitter, due to his large model size, is similarly sold individually. The Fire Spitter is a very straightforward model. He does one thing, and he does it very, very well. He burns things. He's not fast, he's not good at melee, he just burns stuff. If you pair him with the Goblin King in a troop, the Goblin King can bonk him, and he can activate twice in a turn, and burn stuff real good. I once had an absolute beauty of an arcane hand when attacking with the Fire Spitter's Fire Blast ability, holding a blue 2, a 3, and then a couple of 1s, I think. My unfortunate opponent and friend called my bluff 3 times, so I was able to fire off 4 Fire Blasts in one activation, absolutely brutalizing a couple of his models. If Fire Spitter is out of range to roast something, he can use his active ability to give some extra energy to other goblins around him. Now, Gotchgut is another dual faction model. Like all giants in the game, Gotchgut belongs to the Commonwealth faction, but he also dabbles in Dominion escapades. Gotchgut is a very straightforward model. He has 14 health, he does straight up +2 damage whenever he attacks, and he can body block hits for nearby models with the Noble keyword. This bodyguard passive ability can benefit the Goblin King since he is most rightly a noble. Gotchgut is a great Moonstone carrier since he has so much health, and he can plop himself down by a cluster of Moonstones and then force the opponent to deal with him before they can harvest any of those Moonstones. Ribald is one of my favorite models in the game, both from a visual and gameplay standpoint. Ribald, like the Fire Spitter, is a relatively long-range threat with his fire cannon ability. Unlike the Fire Spitter, however, Ribald has a big plug of health since he's a troll, and he has a passive ability to help push more melee damage, so he's not a model your opponent is super eager to engage in with melee. Also, it's worth noting his fire cannon ability can be fired in melee, unlike some of the other ranged attacks in the game. So even if you lock him in melee, not only can he punch you, but his little buddy on his shoulders can still fire straight down into your face with the cannon. Additionally, his signature move and his arcane ability's catastrophe effect provide for a huge AoE damage and knockback effect. This could be something you actually aim to trigger yourself in the right situation. If you find yourself in the midst of multiple enemy models, or even if you're a bit crazy and need to sacrifice some health to push a friendly model up or down the table. Make no mistake though, this guy can be a lethal range threat. His fire cannon ability could potentially push through 8 wounds if you get really lucky on your card draw, and since he has both the Goblin and Troll keywords, the Goblin King can bonk him and allow him to activate twice to fire his cannon 2 times in a turn. Boulder is a Troll, so he's a tough opponent to take down due to his high health pool. Boulder's specialty though is getting up close and personal with enemy models and sapping their energy and beating them down with his extra impact damage. He also has an arcane ability to sing a sweet stone siren song to Moonstones, causing them to shake themselves up to the surface for easier harvesting. Now for the next troop box we're going to discuss, it is the Masquerade, which is a troop of 3 humans. The Dominion isn't just goblins and trolls. There's an entire fairy subfaction that I haven't collected yet. There's a handful of humans, including a human pirate box that I haven't painted up. Oh, and there's a box of goblin pirates that I haven't even purchased yet. But for now, let's talk about the Masquerade troop box. This first model, Creep, appropriately named, is all about manipulating enemy models for the benefit of Creep's troop. Creep can increase an enemy's evade stat, making them easier to hit with arcane abilities. This would be amazing in conjunction with the Fire Spitter and Ribald, so they have a better chance to draw those 2s and 3s. He can also sap the health and energy of enemy models through his Vitality Draw and Incubus abilities, respectively, and distribute those resources to his own team. Taking away enemy energy and giving your own models more energy are very powerful effects in this game. Now the Duchess. The Duchess has some really useful passive abilities, including the ability to add 1 to your initiative roll each turn, which gives you a greater chance to go first. She also forces enemy models to suffer a wound before performing an action against her, and she, being the masochist that she is, heals whenever another character suffers wounds from a catastrophe effect. Similar to Creep with Duchess's Succubus ability, she can deal wounds to an enemy character and then distribute that much health and energy among your friendly models. This ability, especially with the energy restoration, can really help charge up some of your models early in the turn to allow them to pull off more attacks, moves, or abilities later in the turn. Claudia Develle. So Claudia is a character that cannot be slowed down by otherwise hindering terrain pieces like woodland patches and water features, allowing her to get in and out of areas of the table faster than other models. She also specializes in being able to rob opponents of their Moonstones, and with her shoot pistol and brace of pistols abilities, she can forego the need to reload once per game to pull off a Hong Kong action movie guns akimbo move to throw out a slew of gunshots when it matters most. She could fit into many Dominion troops, but would also fit right in among a pirate list where many of the characters also have pistols, giving you something of a fast gunline troop. So the next troop box we'll showcase in this video is my most recently finished one. This box, the Cursed, is a dual faction box, and every unit can be taken in either a Dominion or Lechevault list. Lechevault is the game's more woodland and spirit-themed faction. Little Anya Bartal here is a young lady with a very sinister side to her. She's the first character in the game with two models to represent her. She begins the game in her normal, innocent-looking form, but can use an active ability or a signature melee move to transform into Striga Anya. Normal Anya is a decent little healer who, due to her Look of Innocence passive ability, will be costly for the enemy to attempt to attack. Since attacking such an adorable little girl is pretty soul-crushing, it will cost opponents an additional energy to target her with an action. If she wants to avoid a melee or step in closer for a melee, she has her Swift passive ability to reaction step an extra inch. If she can get one additional energy, or if she converts a high guard in melee, she can transform into Striga Anya, becoming a brutal melee opponent, but foregoing her ability to heal, and obviously her ability to look innocent. The Beast is a high-health melee brawler with some abilities to debuff his melee opponents or any enemies who come near him. I haven't played him yet on the table, so I can't offer too much more input into his utility. Before discussing the Revenant, it's worth mentioning that every model in the Curse box has the Noble keyword, with the notable exception of Anya in her Striga Anya form. This opens up the potential for them to be paired with Gotchgut in a Dominion list and have Gotchgut body block hits for them. The Revenant is a super interesting character, and by virtue of his ability to effectively never die, he's a natural frontline speed bump or Moonstone carrier. Due to his presumably ancient age, he has seen every melee move 1,000 times before, so your opponent must always reveal their melee hand to you before they select a card. This has come in really clutch for me, since based on the cards the opponent has, I can typically predict which one they're going to want to play, and by extension, which one I should play to counter it. It's very on theme for this character and really cool in practice. He has a ranged magic attack for when he still hasn't closed the gap with the enemy, and perhaps most interestingly, he has the ability to intentionally trigger a catastrophe on a friendly model through his Visions of the Future active ability. Why would you want to do this, you might ask? Well, he is a Lechevault character as well as a Dominion one, and the Lechevault faction has many characters with abilities whose catastrophe effects can actually prove beneficial in certain circumstances. There are also some uses for this in the Dominion as well, such as Ribald's catastrophic cannon self-detonation that we covered earlier. So those are all the models I painted so far, and apologies for the poor camera quality, but I was shooting it with my cell phone, so you get what you pay for. Those are by no means all of the Dominion models in the game. This represents maybe half of the available Dominion models. I am currently working on painting up a troop of Lechevault minis, Lechevault units composed of the new Tree Folk boxes, and the dual faction Dominion Lechevault Troll, Knoll. To round out the troop of 6 models, I'll likely toss in the Revenant. While I finish working on painting up this troop, I'll patiently awaiting the arrival of my big box of Shades faction minis from Goblin King Games' massively successful Kickstarter campaign late last year. I received a shipping notification yesterday though, so by the time you're watching this, I may actually have them in my possession already. The Shades should have their retail debut sometime in the fall of 2024. And this slide doesn't even show all of the launch units that are coming to Shades, it's just a sample. Now before we conclude, let me tell you why I really love this game. Firstly, the small UK-based team at Goblin King Games are excellent. They are extremely communicative with the community, replying personally on multiple social media channels to questions big or small. For example, when painting one of my goblins several months back, I wanted to know what color Moonstone's goblin's blood was. It's a pretty obscure question, but I figured I'd ask so I could paint my goblin accurately. So I asked in the game's official Discord and received an answer from Susie, narrative lead and head of all things lore, right away. One policy Goblin King Games has related to Kickstarters really shows the company's integrity to me. Whenever they have an active Kickstarter campaign, they focus 100% on fulfilling that campaign and do not release any new unit boxes to retail until that campaign has been fulfilled. This way, backers know that the developers focused entirely on getting those pledges in backers' hands as soon as possible. The team is small, so it's good to know that their energy and efforts are focused in the right places. Now for the game itself. I feel like a lot of folks are lured in by the beautiful minis and world building, and then they stay for the rules. This game plays so differently than most other tabletop games, big or small. It's a small enough game that having a fully painted troop on the table is very achievable, even for slow painters like myself. But it's deep enough that there are multiple layers of synergies to experiment with, making troop building and theory crafting a bottomless joy. Of all the games I've played, this one has the fewest feel-bad moments for me. Regardless of whether I win or lose, and I've lost far more than I've won, I always walk away with some really fun memories, and both players generally had a real wild and wonderful time. It's hard to have a bad time when the models and abilities are just so fun and whimsical. Add to that, the game is superbly balanced, and it truly feels like there's no overpowered troops, and while there are better troop builds than others, no model feels like it has no place in the game. If anyone's gotten this far in the video and has any interest in exploring the game of Moonstone further, I've added a link to the official game website in the description. The game is sold directly by the developer via their website or through some local retailers. Check with local game stores in your area to see if they're stocking Moonstone, and if they don't, maybe encourage them to do so if you want to help build the local community. That's all for this video, everyone. If you enjoyed the video, I hope you'll consider liking and commenting. If you want to see more from this channel, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know as soon as new content drops. I hope the regular viewers of my channel have enjoyed seeing something a little different, but never fear, I plan to continue producing a Song of Ice and Fire content once the next season patch drops. I'd also like to add some more Moonstone content to the channel's repertoire in the future. Until next time, this is Randall, signing off.